I think we need to address the climate finance issue for adaptation. The UN Environment Program estimates that it's on the scale of 400 billion, and probably that's an underestimate. Africa has as many automatic weather stations as all of Germany, so the entire continent. And that means we don't have the climate information, the prediction capabilities, one, to benefit early warning systems in Africa, but that's also a global good. If we had more weather stations across the globe and were better equipped to predict weather events, that actually benefits our predictions of climate here in the UK as well. Something like 50% of our hazards are predictable, and yet only something like 2% of the financing is prearranged. So how can we start to shift that equation so that people get resources not after their home has been destroyed, but ahead of time, so that they can take the measures needed to fortify their homes ahead of a disaster?
Climate change impacts are intensifying across the globe, from devastating floods to scorching heat waves. While reducing emissions remains crucial, adapting to these changes has become equally important for our survival and well being. But adaptation isn't just about building infrastructure or implementing new technologies. It's deeply intertwined with issues of justice, equity, and local empowerment. Today, we are joined by Cristina Rumbaitis Del Rio, a leading expert in the field with nearly 2 decades of experience developing and implementing climate change adaptation programs around the world. She has worked with organizations like the World Resource Institute, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the UK Agency for International Development, tackling critical issues like water management, food security, and locally led adaptation. In this conversation, we'll explore how communities and governments can effectively adapt to climate change, the role of finance in supporting adaptation efforts, and why locally led solutions are often the most successful. We'll also discuss how early warning systems can save both lives and resources, and why adaptation needs to be viewed through the lens of justice and equity. Thank you so much, Christina, for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you here.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Christina, we all know that climate change is wreaking havoc in every part of the world right now. And at the same time, adaptation becomes very crucial for us to deal with its effects. So, for us to begin the conversation, can you contextualize what adaptation is and maybe also explain its importance vis-a-vis mitigation, resilience, and loss and damage?
Sure, absolutely. So there's been traditionally this division between adaptation and mitigation at first, and adaptation is really about preparing and dealing with the consequences of climate change. The fact that the climate has changed, that there's a new normal that is here and is getting worse. And no matter what we do in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, because of the way the climate system works, we are locked into several decades of warming. And so that's the part that's called adaptation. Mitigation is reducing the greenhouse gases that cause global warming. So it's addressing the root causes of global warming, whereas I would say adaptation is the consequences of global warming. And because this has been happening for many decades now, um, we're now seeing loss and damage, which is kind of a third category that has really come up over the past 10 plus years, which acknowledges the fact that people are suffering, that lives and livelihoods have been lost as a result of climate change. And in many cases, that requires financial action as well as other kinds of action to address the fact that people are affected by climate change.
Christina, adaptation happens to be a contentious issue as well, where we see a lot of differences between global north and global south with respect to whether mitigation is important or adaptation is important. Can you please shed a little bit light on that as well?
So yes, yeah. I mean, it shouldn't be contentious because we all need to adapt to the impacts of climate change. And we're seeing across the globe, from the U.S. to India to Germany, to the Gambia, we're seeing climate impacts, growing climate impacts every year. But there's a justice issue here in that a lot of countries in the developing South that are highly vulnerable did very, very little to contribute to climate change, and yet they're having to invest and pay for and suffer the consequences of climate change, and they're needing to pay for adaptation. And it's especially an issue because a lot of the financing the financing isn't as available for adaptation as it is for mitigation. If you look at where climate finance is going, the vast majority is going for mitigation, and accessing finance for adaptation is difficult for many countries. And for many countries, the finance that they are able to access is in the form of loans. And so they're taking loans that they will need to pay back with interest, potentially concessional interest or low interest rates, but they need to pay this back eventually. And they're having to take loans to adapt to something that they did very little to cause. And so there's a justice issue there that has really come up. And this year at the climate summit, which will be held in Baku this year, COP29, it's called. There's a decision that is expected around climate finance, and really it is up to developed countries, which did the most in terms of contributing to climate change, to come up with a new financial target in terms of funding that they will provide and also mobilize for climate action, including both adaptation and mitigation, and potentially loss and damage, although that's very controversial and still being hotly debated.
Thank you so much for explaining and laying the context for the conversation. Now, Christina, you've worked extensively in South Asia, and you've also been involved in projects where you try to include adaptation into the broader developmental agenda.
Yeah.
First, can you share some of those experiences, that how does including adaptation in planning and budgeting look like? And then how does the chain of adaptation in action on ground looks like?
Absolutely, absolutely, and I must say it was an absolute pleasure and highlight of my career to get to live and work in South Asia on adaptation, particularly mainstreaming through a program called Action on Climate Today, which worked with governments at the central level as well as at state and province level to find different entry points for bringing in climate concerns. And so I think what's important there is that climate wasn't necessarily the leading focus, but it was integrated into other issues which climate affects. And so, a very tangible example that sticks in my mind is from the state of Kerala, where we worked with the health department and doctors, really to try and understand what are climate impacts on health that are already being felt and seen in Kerala. And looking at everything from communicable diseases to non-communicable diseases, really to the effect of, for instance, high heat and humidity on pregnant mothers and the number of distressed births that are taking place. And then what could be done to help prepare expectant mothers to know what to do to keep themselves cool, to reduce the number of distress births, and how to care for a newborn infant under high heat and high humidity scenarios. So it's very what I like about that approach, which we call mainstreaming, is it's really tangible, it's really practical, and it's really about understanding in the context what are the climate impacts, what are the threats, and how can they be managed. Sometimes it's simple solutions, sometimes it's bigger solutions. An example from Pakistan, where and this happens throughout the Himalayas, you get glacier outburst floods, glacier lake outburst floods because of the glacial melt that is happening. And so downstream communities need some sort of early warning to know to prepare to evacuate their homes, to get to safety if lakes are going to be or dams are going to be burst. And so developing early warning systems that provide as much anticipation as possible are really key interventions. And that takes, the scientific community, geologists and hydrologists and climatologists working together, but working together with the communities, so the communities and telecom and other and disaster management agencies, so that a warning is communicated, so that it's received, and so people know what to do and where to go and how to respond, which is as critical as the scientific components. So just another example. And to make any of this happening, you need plans, policies, and budgets. And so a key component is really bringing a climate lens into planning, whether it's urban planning systems or agriculture development planning or water management planning, any of these planning mechanisms that we have really need to be taking on board a climate lens and understanding that the climate has changed and will continue to change, and really integrating that into planning. And then in order to do anything, you really need a budget. And so, for instance, in places like Odisha, we worked on climate budgeting. And so looking at the state's budget, and this was really done by government workers, to then identify, okay, these projects that we have in our pipeline are climate sensitive, and so we need to make sure that they are future proofed or climate proofed, and really taking a look at the budgeting process and what information is used in that budgeting process. So that's kind of a high level snapshot of the different points of intervention that become possible when you take a mainstreaming approach, which I think is really, really critical.
Christina, now just because you explained it from the perspective of policy and also this policy being in action, now considering that finance is and will remain an issue considering the divide and how best to unlock funds. My question
Yeah.
to you would be, when you are including adaptation into the mainstreaming process, how critical does finance become? Because as someone who reads what adaptation is, I also understand that it's very locally based. It's something which is context specific, it's something which is area specific. So, what I'm trying to understand is that, do we really have ecosystem based local solutions that we can adopt, or is it more like traditional technological innovations that we must have to be able to adapt? Because what I'm trying to understand is that, do we have to really wait for someone from outside to come and help us, or there are credible ways with which we can rely on ourselves and begin with the adaptation process?
Oh, that's a really good question, and it has a lot of angles to it. But let me address it head on. I guess I would say we don't have to wait for someone from the outside to come in and tell us what to do or to provide funding for adaptation. There are things that governments at all levels can do even civil society, grassroots or community-based organizations can be doing now today with their own resources to help reduce the amount of suffering and losses and negative impacts of climate change. And so I don't think it's an issue of waiting. And I've seen some of the best solutions and low cost effective solutions come from community-based organizations that are creative and are thinking about how do we address this problem? How do we reduce the amount of vector-borne disease that's coming into our cities by, reducing the amount of flooding, by improving trash collection and rubbish collection in places like Gorapur, India, is the example that comes to mind, which was spearheaded by Gorapur Environmental Action Group, or restoring nature-based solutions to absorb floodwaters to keep flooding down in city centers. So there's lots of solutions that can be done at local levels, at state levels, with budgets and even sweat equity of individuals. I think the larger solutions, which might be more in terms of infrastructure and these early warning systems, that takes coordination at higher levels, or even transboundary issues. When you look at flooding, especially in between Nepal and India, that's a transboundary issue. So it takes coordination between countries and sharing of information, and so that can't be only managed at the local level. These bigger solutions take planning and budget, and and that requires higher amounts of resources. Um, and then all of that being said, again, there is a justice issue here, and I think that developed countries that did the most to cause this problem have an obligation to provide resources to support communities and countries in adapting to climate change. So I don't want to absolve them of that responsibility by saying that we can take action now with resources available. So I think the answer to your question is yes, but we need both. We do need resources to come from the outside. I think there's that moral obligation, that justice and equity obligation. But equally, from a justice and equity standpoint, we also can't wait to take action because that's just putting more lives and livelihoods at risk. And often the actions that are taken now early on in the problem are less expensive than those taken later when the problem is greater, right? And so there's also an economic argument to be said that to be made that early action is more economically effective and efficient. And we do see a big return on investment on some of these adaptation actions. So there is incentive to take action now.
Christina, when you say that adaptation also is a justice issue, I'm also reminded of how adaptation in itself can be an inequity issue. Why I say that is because of maladaptation as well, right? I mean,
Yeah.
a seawall protects me, but it puts someone else in danger. So,
Yeah.
would you want to contextualize a little bit of that, and someone who's listening maybe thinks that we should be conscious of while we are thinking about adaptation?
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. And something that is often forgotten, and I'm really glad you brought it up. When we're talking about managing risks, which is fundamentally what adaptation is about, it's important to think about adaptation for whom, and not just adaptation to what, or resilience for whom, as well as resilience to what. And as you write, the example of the seawall is a great example because often that is just exporting risk to someone else and protecting one community versus another. And so it's really important that that these issues be handled in the planning process and implementation and execution process. And that's why there is a big movement around locally led adaptation so that communities have voice and decision making agency in making adaptation decisions. Because there are many examples, unfortunately, of maladaptive practices where where who is allowed to take certain risks, and who is protected and who is not protected, are can really reinforce marginalization and poverty and lack of agency. And so it's really important that our processes for identifying adaptation options, for planning and implementing them actually address these issues of equity and marginalization. Otherwise, you're just shifting risk around and you're not actually reducing it. And you may even be magnifying it.
Christina, if you were supposed to put all of this information with respect to how this adaptation is really shaping our global efforts, would you want to shed a little bit light on what is happening with respect to the global discussion on adaptation? I know that you are actively participating in global goal on adaptation as well. So maybe if you want to shed light some of those efforts.
Sure, sure. So taking a step back even further, the Paris Agreement, which was agreed in 2015, which is kind of overseeing our climate action, established something called the Global Goal on Adaptation, and that goal is to improve adaptive capacity, enhance resilience, and reduce vulnerability to climate impacts, in line with the temperature goal established by the Paris Agreement, which is to keep global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that's a very high level goal, and kind of needs to be made more tangible. And so last year at the Climate Summit, which was held in Dubai, that was COP28, countries agreed to a new framework for global climate resilience. It's called the UAE Framework for Global Climate Resilience. And it has a number of targets around food and water security, around health, infrastructure, ecosystems, even cultural heritage, livelihoods, and poverty as well as a number of targets related to planning and implementation and identifying of climate risks, and monitoring and evaluating action and progress. And so it's a comprehensive framework that was agreed. And now a 2-year work program has been launched to identify indicators that will tell us, ideally, if we're making progress against those targets. But what I think is important is this helps to make adaptation more tangible, and saying, we're looking for water security and sanitation for all, in spite of a changing climate. We're looking for health and nutrition for all, in spite of a changing climate. And so it really ties together development objectives, the Sustainable Development Goals, all of these goals that we've set for ourselves at the global level, but acknowledging that climate change is happening and that achieving those goals will require additional action, and investment, to realize them. And so again, it's taking that mainstreaming approach, which I think is important to make those goals more tangible, and those targets more tangible. So that's something that's been happening in terms of climate diplomacy for past several years now. There's still more work to be done, but I hope it starts to sort of trickle down into national adaptation plans, into state and local plans, for adapting to climate change, and really all of the development work that so many actors across the world are working on. We need to do it a bit differently because of climate change.
You talk about making adaptation more tangible and talking about that and trickling it down to what's happening on the national level, there's another project with which you are working on that's on early warnings for all.
Yeah.
And I think when we talk about adaptation, like right now in India, we are preparing for another storm on the coast of Odisha by the name of Dana.
Yeah.
And they're saying that they'll be evacuating 1 million people so that
Wow.
uh, we can protect ourselves from its effects. So that's a perfect example for early warning. But we know that there are many other aspects where our early warnings are not that robust and we suffer a lot of damages too. So I would be interested to know more about what's happening there because I think that's that one area which holds a lot of promise when it comes to adaptation. Also, because an interesting fact that I was reading that if we invest $1 in early warnings, we could save somewhere close to $4 or $7 in future for that $1 invested. So it makes economic sense as well. So would you want to tell a little bit more about what's happening there?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. So in 2022, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres announced this initiative called Early Warnings for All that seeks to provide early warning information, actionable early warning information for everyone on Earth by 2027. So it's hugely ambitious. And the clock is ticking, and there's a huge gap in that, about 50% of the world doesn't have end-to-end early warning systems that are fit for purpose for the climate challenges we have today, and certainly getting worse in many parts of the world. And so, what is important about this approach is one, it has that top level support of the Secretary General, really commissioning UN as a whole to work together to address this issue. But second is the end-to-end multi-hazard part of it. So it's not just about cyclones, it's really taking on board holistic set of climate risks and hazards. And it's doing the work of working across the entire value chain. So it's the forecasting and the observation systems that are needed to make better predictions and make early warnings, but it's also understanding the risk environment, and the vulnerability of infrastructure or roads or hill slopes to landslides that goes beyond just the climate domain and the meteorological domain, but into really understanding the risk landscape. And then the communications, because if a warning isn't communicated, it's not received, it's not understood, it's worthless. And then the last piece, which needs so much attention and resourcing, is the action. Because you need to be able to know what action to take, how to take action, and have often resources to be able to take action, whether that's fortifying your home or evacuating or protecting your livestock and crops, if that's a possibility. So there's so much more to that early action piece that really needs investment, and something like 50% of our hazards are predictable, and yet only something like 2% of the financing is prearranged. So how can we start to shift that equation so that people get resources not after their home has been destroyed, but ahead of time, so that they can take the measures needed to fortify their homes ahead of a disaster, or buy generators, or whatever actions need to be taken and can be taken, which again is much more cost effective than having to rebuild homes and livelihoods after the fact. So it's really trying to shift the paradigm along that entire value chain. And, I think there's a lot to be learned from the Indian context. I think there's been a lot of successful case studies that are coming from India, which luckily are getting out to inform the rest of us. But I think it's such a critical issue, and you're right. There is a strong return on investment in investing in early warning systems, and so I'm glad to see this getting the attention it deserves. It certainly needs more attention and more resourcing. And sorry, one other data point that I want to point out is the climate information systems. Africa has as many automatic weather stations as all of Germany, so the entire continent, and that means we don't have the climate information, the prediction capabilities. One, to benefit early warning systems in Africa, but that's also a global good. If we had more weather stations across the globe and were better equipped to predict weather events, that actually benefits, I'm sitting here in the UK, that would benefit our predictions of climate here in the UK as well. And so that's a huge area of need for investment.
We are inching closer towards the time limit, Christina, but I think we've covered contextualizing how we implement it on the ground, what are the international efforts. So now, if I were to frame my last question before we have our LinkedIn question, I would want to ask what are some of the critical next steps that you see being advanced in the adaptation journey?
Yeah. So I think we need to address the climate finance issue for adaptation. There is a huge adaptation finance gap. The UN Environment Program estimates that it's on the scale of 400 billion. Um, and probably that's an underestimate. And so we need to figure out globally how to mobilize the resources that countries and communities need to adapt to climate change. As I said, that's a moral responsibility, but it also makes economic sense to make those investments now. So that's one big piece. Two, I think we need to be asking the climate question much more routinely in our planning, development, budgeting, policy making processes. And again, this can't depend on people from the outside coming in to do that, but it needs to be asked within our health systems, within our health infrastructure, within our water infrastructure, our agriculture and food security, even trade and infrastructure are climate vulnerable. And so we need to start addressing these vulnerabilities and risks. And that means first kind of asking that climate question. Um, and then I think as a third, and it's very much related. There needs to be global solidarity on this issue. We need to be learning from each other. We need to be supporting each other. As I said, there's so much good practice in South Asia to learn from that I wish we're getting out more. And again, we're all vulnerable to this, so we need to be much more efficient about learning and taking action and supporting each other. So those would be the three things I think need to happen next, and they're big things.
Thank you so much. Christina, we have one LinkedIn question from Jay. He asked the difference between adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage, and I think we've covered that. Another aspect that he asked was, how does one measure adaptation?
Oh, such a good question. And that is really at the crux of the work that's going on now to identify indicators for this global goal on adaptation and the targets in the UAE framework for global climate resilience. What I will say is currently there's a spreadsheet with something like 9,000 indicators in it that 78 different technical experts from around the globe are grappling with to try and identify, okay, which ones have climate relevance behind them. And so that's very much at a global scale. There's a process underway. What I will say is it's going to be multifaceted because there's not just one indicator that is going to tell us everything we need to know because adaptation touches on every aspect of our lives and all of these different sectors. Um, but second, I think, it really depends on the context and what adaptation looks like, in Assam is going to look very different from what it looks like in my village here in the UK. And so it needs to be contextualized in what are the climate risks that you're facing, what are the sort of priorities of a community or entity, and then it also needs to be filtered through what you're able to measure and practically measure, because we might be able to develop the most sophisticated monitoring and evaluation systems, but if we can't afford it and it's too impractical, it's not really useful. And so there's a measure of practicality there too that needs to be factored in. I hope that helps answer the question from LinkedIn.
Yeah, for sure. These were all the questions from my end, Christina. Thank you so much for your time. I am really hopeful that this issue deserves, it deserves much more attention, but I hope that even without enough attention, there is enough traction, at least on the ground, to take off multiple projects. And so that, as we say, that it's more about survival as well for many people who are more vulnerable.
Yeah.
And I think it's high time that this issue deserves attention. And thank you so much for highlighting some of these issues and the work that you do and for your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.